clearly that's not
Yep.
not the way to go. And yet I'm pretty sure there's something going on. I mean, I'm trying to think how this might be useful to sort of open up that conversation. You know, it may ask you some questions and so forth, in the hopes that they just won't, you know, completely withdraw.
Yeah, it might be useful. I mean, you want to, in that case, right? What's the purpose of getting them a screening? One of the purposes is that you want to enroll them. And this is a program specifically that we can spend more time. What I usually say is, I don't say that that'll make you enroll them. I say we can spend more time with people who've suffered from mental illness or been treated for mental illness. And a lot of people will identify they've been treated, but not suffering from mental illness. So can we ask you some questions? I would also advise them that they can stop the screening anytime they want, and they can skip any questions they want. So you get what you can and you try it out. If people start to become hostile and start to become defensive, stop it, right? You can also use that other form, which is right in the case notes, what you're seeing and what makes you believe they have mental illness. So give me some examples. What are you seeing? Somebody who does those behaviors. You're linking hostility, okay? So a lot of times when people get hostile, it's because they have fixed delusions, right? So let's say you had somebody who believes that they're being tracked, right? And they say things to you like, you can't bring your cell phone here. I have to live in a place with no electronics. I have to, people are tracking me and they're watching me. Okay. So just writing that down, right? And writing down what effect that has on their life so that the person is unable to tolerate being in shelters. Hotels are of concern to them. They might be interested in housing, but it has to be someplace away from any power lines and away from, I'm just making this up. So you put that down and then you talk to your supervisor or somebody, you have people in your agency who are clinicians. You talk to your supervisor or clinician and say, look, this is what I'm seeing. And the clinician says, yep, looks like they might have mental illness. How interested are they in getting help for that? And you say, actually, they get agitated every time I mention it. So it seems like that the part that you're going to try to work people towards it is if you write down in the notes that you ask people if there was anything that was ever helpful that came out of the system. Did they ever have a worker who was helpful? What did they do? So we can start to identify what they might link with, and that would satisfy, and you say it for the purposes of the SAMHSA is, identifying the people, identifying what worked for them in the past will help us link them with services, and you're done. You don't have to do the MMS screen. Right? It's a little more complicated, and MMS does handle anxiety disorders and affective disorders, meaning depression or mania or that sort of thing. And that it gets a little more complicated and it might provide a little more. So let me give you an example, is that it's not uncommon that homeless people become withdrawn, right? And that they learn to sort of disappear in the background as a matter of survival. So if one of the things you say is they have a flat affect, a supervisor might ask you, or you might ask yourself, is this to fold into the background and protect themselves? Is this functional in their life or is this dysfunctional, right? So you want to think about that. And it may be a benefit to do the MMS screen then. If you want to get them talking about the symptoms, I would try it, right? But if people are become agitated, it's not worth it, right? There's other ways to do it, and you have ways to, you're engaging people. And if you feel it'll really disrupt the engagement, back off a little bit, right? Sometimes people see it as a relief because it's completely behaviorally or symptom-based. And so that's helpful, but sometimes people see it as an affront to themselves. And, you know, part of a lot of mental illnesses are you deny the mental illness, right? And that people have a lot of reasons to be afraid. They've been hospitalized against their will, probably, particularly if they have a psychotic disorder, and had medications pushed on them, and they want to avoid that in the future. And that's going to take trust in your relationship that that's not what you do. So, you know, it may be later on. I mean, there's a couple of ways to use it. One is as to enable the enrolling, and the other way is to get some more clarity on their symptoms so you can transfer this. So you could also enroll somebody through a case note and talking to your supervisor, and then do the MMS screen later because you think it might be beneficial. It helps them identify symptoms. Does that make sense? Okay. There it is. Oh. Okay. So this is the MMS screen, and Shannon kindly, because believe me, I didn't do it, put this in the PowerPoint, but I'm going to actually pull up the full screen so you don't have to read for font. You have the screen, you can pull it up in front of you. We put it in the PowerPoint just so you'd have it accessible. Okay. So let's look at the MMS screen, okay? So what's the first question? Have you been consistently depressed or down most of the day, nearly every day for the past 2 weeks, right? So people are going to ask you what that means, right? And what that means is been inactive to the point where you really can't take care of yourself, where it's hard for you to even get up and do the most basic things for yourself. And then it's a struggle for you. So you want to talk to people about that. It has to be read as exactly as written because that's how SAMHSA verified it, but we can explain things. So have you been less interested in most things and unable to enjoy things in your life? That lack of joy, which goes to lack of affect, is a big sign of depression. So that's what we're going for here. Have you felt sad, low, depressed most of the time for the last 2 years? My heart breaks for somebody who feels like that. In the past month, did you think you would be better off dead or wish you were dead? We have a longer explanation for that. If somebody answers yes to that they wish they were dead, we want to assess suicidality. And we've got some tools for you for there. At that point, I would stop the assessment, right? And talk to them about that a little bit. Because if somebody is wishing themselves dead, has a plan, or if this is a chronic feeling, we want to know about that if it's immediate, right? And if it's not, then we can do a safety plan, but we're going to need some help doing that. Has that come up? Is that a question you're comfortable asking? Okay. Have you had a period of time when you were feeling up, hyper, or so full of energy or full of yourself that you got into trouble, or that other people thought you were not your usual self? Do not consider times when you were intoxicated on drugs or alcohol. Okay. You can make that a little more specific to people. Did they have pressured speech? Was it hard to make a decision? Was it hard to focus? Those sorts of things. But what you're looking for here is mania. Do you guys know what mania looks like? Yes? No?
Could you say a little more about that?
Yeah.
I think so, but I want to be confirmed in that.
So what they're looking for is an affective disorder. Specifically, usually it's rare, it's just mania. Usually it's depression and mania. So that people have racing thoughts. They oftentimes have pressured speech. Sometimes sort of delusions of grandeur comes to it. I'm not worried about housing. I own the whole town. I just own the whole town. One of the things that I know about mania is when somebody's experiencing mania and they're talking to me, my heart starts racing, right? Have you ever felt that? If you feel that, it may be fear, but if you feel that, you want to think about what that person is doing. So it is, the other thing is people traditionally get into bad trouble. You'll see an increase in substance. You'll see an increase in gambling, those sorts of things. Sex is another thing that people do a lot of and pretty indiscriminately when they're manic. So that's the sort of, do you do things that get you into trouble? But the way I think about it is they leave themselves they're very impulsive, right? Impulsivity comes with a lot of things, including the histories that our people have had, right? Because they're in crisis most of their life, and impulsivity is part of crisis, but it's impulsivity to the extreme. The other thing is people have a very hard time sitting still, right? Once again, that can come from anxiety, that can come from other things, but it's the group of symptoms that's described here that you're really looking for. The pressured speech is a pretty good indicator. Have they had a period of time? Have you ever been so irritable, grouchy, or annoyed for several days? COVID's going to make this one interesting. That you had arguments, had verbal or physical fights, shouted at people outside your family. Have you or others noticed that you've been more irritable, overreacted? That's a big part of this. And compared to other people, even when you thought you were right to act this way.
So shouting at people in your family is okay?
Evidently. I would say most decidedly no. And shouting at your path outreach worker is also not okay. You can ask it in a very simple tone. Oh, we're recording this, but I often ask people, are you pissed off most of the time? Right? And people can usually, right? But the problem is, if you look at the news with all the things that are going on in COVID, most people are irritated and angry most of the time. So that, we want to normalize this a little bit, but this is really to the extreme. The other thing that I ask people sometimes is, do you find yourself getting so mad you can't think? And sometimes people can relate to that, right? So we're going to ask the question as asked, but if people ask us to explain it, we'll explain it. So if you're trying to de-escalate people and not get them all worked up, I wouldn't say, well, now would be a good example. You're shouting about this screen, right? It's fairly normal for people to get agitated when people ask them a lot of personal questions. All right. So have you had one or more occasions where you felt intensely anxious, frightened, uncomfortable, uneasy, even when most people don't feel that way? That's a key to this question, right? Most people living outside are going to be anxious most of the time. Most people that I know that live outside don't sleep at night because they feel like they're too vulnerable. Is that a symptom of a mental illness? No, that's a symptom of survival, right? So we want to put this in context. Even when most people don't feel this way, do these intense feelings get to be their worst within 10 minutes? Really what they're after here is, do people, what I refer to as sky up? Like, do they get a little bit agitated and then they get very agitated within 10 minutes? Is their reaction time shortened? Or do they think about things over a period of time and get madder and madder, which is also problematic, but it's not that question, right? Okay. Do you feel anxious or uneasy in places or situations where you might have had panic-like symptoms? We just spoke about. Or do you feel anxious or uneasy in situations where help might not be available or escape might be difficult? Like being in a crowd, standing in line, being alone, away from home or alone at home, crossing a bridge, traveling in a bus or car. So you know what we're describing, right? People who just can't tolerate these things, which are part of life. I mean, frankly, I would feel anxious in a place I couldn't figure out an escape route. And part of that has to do with, I don't know, historical stuff. Is that right after 9/11, they really trained us, look for the exits in every room, make sure the exits are accessible and stuff like that. And I do that every time. Is it a symptom of a mental illness? Maybe, but it's also within a context. And most people who have been through the same experience, which is something we want to pay a lot of attention to, might feel the same way. So if you ask 10 New Yorkers, 8 out of 10 would say they would definitely feel anxious in a place they can't escape from. Right? So there, we want to temper the shared experience. And I want you to think about that as we go down the questions, because that's also going to have a cultural effect, historical trauma effect. So I'll give you another example, right? Do you feel when people are offering something that they're trying to hurt you? Okay. So in the African American community, there was the Tuskegee experiment, which is horrific, right? And they gave men syphilis and they didn't treat them. And for a while, people were talking about, well, in African American communities, a lot of people are very resistant to the vaccine. Is that a symptom of mental illness? God, no. That's a symptom of survival and historical trauma. And other people in the same situation might question the same thing. Doesn't mean that people don't come around and make other decisions around the vaccine. It means they have a healthy skepticism of anything that's coming out of the government like that, right? Which is normal. So we want to be very careful that we don't make judgments about it. Give you another example. Someplace I was fairly recently in Puerto Rico, a big part of the spirituality is that people see visions. Is that a psychotic process? No. It's a shared psychotic process, and it's part of the culture. It's part of the religion. It's part of the culture. It's part of the spirituality. We see the same thing in Native American communities, right? So we want to be really clear about, would other people in the same situation feel the same way? Making the differentiation between mental illness and cultural norms, spiritual norms, right? I mean, people experience things different ways. Another thing, right? If I'm driving down the road and the police stop me, I don't feel the need to put my hands on the steering wheel, not touch anything, and fear for my life, right? But I have plenty of friends who do, and it's because of the history, and it's because of what's been going on. That's not a mental illness. That's a survival skill, right? These are all, I mean, I feel awful about that, but it's a systemic, it's a response to a systemic problem, right? Which is what they're doing is survival. It is not a mental illness. So we have to be careful about those sort of cultural and racial norms, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Have you worried excessively or been anxious about several things over the past 6 months? The answer is no to this question. Answer no to 10 and proceed. Okay. So have you been excessively anxious over several things in the past couple of months? Put it in context. People are homeless. If they are anxious every day over a place to sleep, is that mental illness?
And it's COVID.
and it's COVID. Would you consider that mental illness or survival? So it's the context of there are other people. What are you worried about most days? And it's not like we don't want to write these things down, because it's helpful in terms of offering people services. If we know they're anxious about finding a place to sleep, then the motivation might be higher to find housing, right? And we want to talk to them about housing. We also want to help them find a safe place to live. These are things that come out separately from the mini screen, but it's not mental illness, right? Okay. If they're worried constantly and it affects their ability to move forward, so the anxiety is maybe appropriate, but the response is overly anxious and it interferes with them being able to function, then the answer would be yes. So then it's a combination. It's they're overly focused on their survival, and that, well, how can you say that? I guess they're overly, it is not a function. Survival is a function, right? Survival increases people's function. It actually interferes with their survival. You want to think about that too. In the past month, were you afraid or embarrassed when others were watching you, or you were the focus of attention? Embarrassed. Are you afraid of being humiliated, speaking in public, eating in public with others, writing while somebody watches, being in social situations? Okay, we're looking for the extreme here, right? And we're looking for it to interfere with people's functioning. I mean, most people feel those things. I don't know, maybe they don't. Maybe I should take this mini screen myself.
Maybe I should.
Okay. In the past month, have you been bothered by thoughts, impulses, or images that you couldn't get rid of, or that were unwanted, distasteful, inappropriate, intrusive, distressing, being afraid that you would act on the impulses that would be really shocking, worrying a lot about dirty, contaminated, having germs? Well, worry a lot about contaminating others that would harm someone, even if you didn't want to, having fears and superstitions, for things going wrong, being obsessed with sexual thoughts, images, impulses. So this used to be referred to as intrusive thoughts, right? And you want to think about it over the norm. Most people are really worried about, being infected with this pandemic that we're dealing with. And most people are worried about giving it to somebody else. But these are intrusive thoughts that interfere with people's daily functioning. They're really looking for things like people having an impulse, for instance, to whop somebody, to hit somebody, right? And being afraid that they'll actually do it and that they'll end up in jail. But it's almost like an obsession, right? So that's what you want to think about. That's what they're looking for. In the past month, do you do something repeatedly without being able to resist doing it? Hand washing, counting, repeating, collecting, arranging things, other superstitious rituals. You know what we're looking for here? People who do ritualized things to protect themselves. So, I mean, we're told to wash our hands. If you look at most people's bags, they've got hand wash sanitizer, right? And they probably do it constantly. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about rituals that make people feel safe, right? Like repeatedly not stepping on cracks, or having to enter a building a certain way, or things that interfere with their functioning. Does that make sense? You guys can stop me at any point this doesn't make sense. And if people ask you questions you'll feel uncomfortable with. Okay. Have you re-experienced an awful event in a distressing way in the past month? We're talking about flashbacks, right? Physical reactions. Something bad happened to them. I'll give you an example is, we were working with some people who were sexual abuse survivors, and most of the abuse happened in bathrooms, and they found themselves unable to go into the bathroom. That's an example, right? That's what we're looking for. Discovering a body, it could be a fire, it could be a kidnapping, could be a death of somebody close to you, is situations that they avoid that they need for their functioning, right? And if they have intense recollections of it, that can be pretty debilitating. We're looking for things that make people uncomfortable, right? And that we can help them with. And then these are the section C is really around psychosis. If you ever believe that people were spying on you, or that somebody was plotting against you or trying to hurt you within a context. So I know people that told me that they fear that the COVID vaccine contains a live virus, even though we know from the research, but in their experience, the research and the information they get is not always accurate, right? So we're talking about historical trauma, and we're talking about real experience. That's not what this is asking for. We want to do it within a context. Have you ever believed that somebody was reading your mind or could hear your thoughts, and that you could actually read somebody else's mind or hear what another person is thinking? Has anybody ever experienced that with a client? So let me give you an example. I had a client who would always say, I know what you're thinking. I can hear it. You think I'm stupid. You keep saying in your own mind, why is he so stupid? It's awful, right? But some of it may stem from the fact that he had gotten that message from people, and that he assumed I was doing it, or that he actually believes I'm thinking it and he can read my thoughts. There's a difference, right? Have you ever believed someone or some force outside yourself put thoughts in your mind that were not your own, that made you act in a way that was not your usual self? Or have you ever felt that you were possessed? That you were being forced to do things that were not natural to you? What this is really after, in the most extreme, is command hallucinations. Do you know what those are? No. Command hallucinations, people hear voices, right? Sometimes people hear several voices. It's a symptom of schizophrenia and some psychotic disorders. And sometimes the voices run a regular commentary. I had one person whose voices told them jokes. But when you hear voices that are telling you to do things like push that person in the street, right? And it becomes almost a compulsion, that's what you're worried about, right? So you want to ask people if the voices are telling them, right? Telling them to do things, or feel possessed, meaning that someone else has control over your body and your instincts. That's what this is about. Have you, I'm laughing because one of my clients once told me, I asked him about command hallucinations. Do you ever hear voices that tell you to do things? Pretty much this question. And he said, well, yeah, I have a voice and it's sometimes quiet and sometimes loud, but it tells me to kill my case manager. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, that one we got. All right, we're going to stop this questioning and we're going to talk about that for a minute. Did he ever have a history of doing anything violent? No, but command hallucinations can be dangerous, right?
Yeah.
By the way, that's very unusual that somebody hears that specific a command hallucination. And at first I wasn't sure if he was making a joke because he was a funny guy, right? If he was making a joke to try to get my attention, or was he, but he was really hearing that voice. I'm laughing now, but I wasn't laughing then, I'll tell you that. And he's fine. He got on a little medication and that really helped. It's interesting to me, and I'll tell you something, the first time through this form, I went through it a couple of times to prepare for this. And the first time through this form, I wasn't aware of this. But they talk about discomfort, but I don't think I was really internalizing it. But these are things that would make people seek treatment, right? So it's an interesting way this form is arranged. There are things that would make people seek treatment. So it may actually motivate people to take treatment. So David, consider that when you're talking about who would this be good for. It may actually do that. I mean, not if it agitates them, but it's an interesting form, and you might want to consider, once the person calms down a little bit, try it again. Have you believed you're being sent? Oh, okay. Have you ever believed that someone, oh, we did that, force, okay. Have you ever believed that you were being sent special messages through the TV, radio, or newspaper? Did you believe someone you did not personally know was particularly interested in you, right? And the interesting thing here is when you start to go down this, it could be positive or negative. So I had somebody I worked with one time who really had a firm belief that everybody was interested in dating him, including all the staff at the building. And it really interfered with his functioning, right? So oftentimes we go to the negative, like you think somebody's going to hurt you or they're following you for some reason, but it could also be something that could be interpreted as positive and ego building, but it's not true. And it would interfere with them because the way that he interacted with everybody is like a potential date. So he couldn't get a lot of his needs met. And he couldn't, actually got thrown out of a lot of restaurants because of the way he related to the wait staff. And that was actually something that brought him to some treatment. Have your relatives or friends ever considered any of your beliefs strange or unusual? This is really an extreme, right? Most of us have relatives and friends. I mean, you're outreach workers. I would be pretty damn surprised if nobody in your family thought you were nuts to be doing this. Is that true? So, right? And we're in hyper separated politics. So there's some of that. That's not what we're talking about here. Talking about extremes. Have you ever heard things people couldn't hear, such as voices? This is actually not a bad way to ask that question. It sort of takes it down a notch. And have you ever had visions when you were awake, or have seen things other people couldn't see? Right? And this is where you want to be very careful. In most places, you want to be very careful of the cultural implications there. Could some people see the visions? Were there any shared visions? That sort of thing. You're going to score it. You're going to count each yes as a 1, and then you're going to add them up. And if everybody answers every question as yes, doesn't mean they have mental illness. It means there's a reason to suspect mental illness. It also would be very unusual if you're getting a 22. And that may mean that they think this will get them into supportive housing or get them a subsidy. So we've got to be careful about understanding that, because they can't get some subsidies without an actual evaluation, and we want to be careful about explaining that, right? An MMS screen is not going to work for that, or seeing somebody with a license who can sign the HUD disability form. This might be helpful to them in getting an opinion, but it's not in itself introduction to a subsidy, but it is an introduction to more services. One of the ways that people can get more services. And I can't emphasize enough, people can get more services even if they're unable to complete this form, right? We just have to do it a different way, which is a little bit more complicated because it requires that you catalog the symptoms and also talk to a supervisor or somebody with a license about it and sort of make a plan. But as long as you do that, you don't have to fill out this form. I'm not trying to talk you out of this form. I think that there's some uses. And so there we go. Yeah, people have had a lot of, I got something in the chat. I thought it might have been a question. Do people have any questions about this form? You can help people clarify it, but they want you to ask the questions as asked. We're also going to tell people that they can stop when they want to, right? And if they want to skip a question, they can skip a question. We'll offer them the option to go back to the skip questions, but they can also decline. Right? We don't want to be in a position where we're forcing people to do it. Okay. Did everybody get a copy of this? It's both in the chat and it was sent to you. Okay. So the advantages of the mini screen. Non-clinical staff can do it. It can also be self-administered. We can hand it to people and see if they want to fill it out. SAMHSA suggests that you stay fairly close so you can answer questions, or you make some sort of arrangements depending on what's comfortable for people so they can ask questions, but they can do it self-administered. And that might be a better way for some people. It's been researched and tested as a reliable tool. So that means you have to read the questions as asked, but you can clarify them later. And it really identifies people in need of a full mental health assessment. But as we know, just because somebody needs something, it doesn't mean that we're gonna, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily automatic that they get one. So that it would mean that we would try to get somebody a mental health assessment, right? And we want to talk about what those resources are that you have to do an assessment. Do most of you have licensed people as part of your work there who can do a mental health assessment? Yeah, David does. Maya, yeah. How about Elizabeth? Yeah, you have them. Will they go out to see the person? Yeah, so that's why either the cataloging the symptoms and the notes and then talking to the supervisor or doing the mini screen are the best option for people that you're going to have a hard time getting to come in to see somebody. Do you have people who won't come in that are only outreach? Yeah. Yeah. So that's why Demas was really pushing to give you guys another option to do this, because they don't want you to delay enrollment, because enrollment means you can spend more time with people, right? And they count. The mini screen doesn't determine treatment. You can't get a treatment from that. You really need an assessment. This is just a cataloging of symptoms or a screen for symptoms. And as mental illness is seen, we still make every effort to connect the person to treatment. Some of the questions in there will help people identify what they're uncomfortable with and think about that for a minute. And that might compel some people to treatment, right? But it's not enough of an assessment to really provide the kind of targeted treatment that most people need. And then, we talk to people, we ask them if they would answer some questions. We'd like to offer you some questions. It'll help us guide our work together, and it may identify more resources to help. That's an important thing, right? And the big one is more of your time. These questions are personal. If you feel uncomfortable with a question, feel free to skip it. We'll stop when you decide that you want to, right? So it should be a very gentle process. This is just an example. You can use your own words, but you're getting the point, right? We're not going to force anybody to do this. And the screen doesn't identify all symptoms of SPMI. So even if somebody gets a 2 on the screen, it doesn't mean they don't have SPMI. SPMI is serious and persistent mental illness. But this screen is limited to mood disorders, like we said, both mania and depression, anxiety disorders, and psychotic disorders. And those are usually the things that get most in people's ways, but there's all sorts of other options, right? Post-traumatic stress syndrome. There's some questions that might relate to it, definitely, but that can be very debilitating. It's going for the things that they find most debilitating to helping people move forward. So we've got a poll. I'm going to pull it up. Okay, Shannon. So it's very quick, should pop up. Here it comes. So it's, can you see yourself using the mini screen? It's yes, no, or don't know. Good. Okay. Okay, so 8 out of 9 people said yes. 1 person said don't know. And yeah, it's going to be different for every person, and there's a lot of things you want to consider, but I think it's pretty useful. So we're going to do 2 breakouts and just talk to each other about an example of where you think this might be useful. Person you're working with now, who you think it might be useful to use this screen in order to be able to enroll people, in order to be able to start the process. So Shannon's going to break you out into, I don't know, smaller groups. So 4 groups, maybe 3 or 4. And just talk about this. She's also going to put these questions in the chat so that you got them. They're pretty simple. Can you identify an example of when this screen might have been useful, and how would you approach it? Everybody see in the chat? Nope, it's not in the chat yet. Okay. So you've got to affirmatively join. Just press join, and there you go.
I'm talking and not.
Yeah.
Okay, questions are in the chat, and I'm going to put it broadcast message to all. I'll do it there also.
And we can take about 10 minutes. Sorry, I should have said that. I would broadcast it 10 minutes.
Okay, just want to say to the people, still Shonda, Robe, Leroy, you've got to click yes to join the group.
What group is Leroy assigned to? We can reassign.
Let me. Leroy is in. Oh, it says he's unassigned. Was he new? I can assign him somewhere.
Okay.
Assign to.
How about 4?
4?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, did it.
Yep. They might have stepped away from their desk, but just in case, I'm going to assign them to another group so it pops up on their screen.
Okay.
You might want to pause the,
Recording?
yeah.
All right, hang on.
I had a good conversation with Corinne. Is it necessary to say to the client, hey, I'd like to work with you on the screening, or can we sort of work some of it, like work it into conversation? Say, I might want to run through section C with somebody who I think is dealing with some sort of psychotic disorder. Would that be appropriate?
I think that, so there, because this has been validated, they're pretty clear that it has to be read as written, right?
From beginning to end?
Yeah, well, beginning to end, because the score also is going to have an effect, right?
Okay, all right. I see.
So, but if you separate it out and give the same sort of speech for all of them, and you do it like one section at a time, but sequentially, yeah, I think you're all right. I mean, I would think so. I don't know for sure because I'm not the one that validated it, but I think that you probably are right, because the other part of this is that, you know, I think that in order to have it accepted, however, because you're able to catalog symptoms, you could work some of these questions into conversations and just put them as a note and just
Yeah.
use that other method. If you
Okay.
think these questions are good, then just, you can always use them. It's just not going to have the validation. You can't
Gotcha.
say the MMS is completed, but you could do it like that. Yeah.
And I think you said that the sequence of the questions matters.
I think it does, but I'm not absolutely sure. I know in other tools I validated the sequence mattered, but I am not sure about this one.
Okay,
So I looked at it, but they didn't, I looked at their validation, but they didn't mention the sequence specifically, but they really specifically said,
okay,
do it as written. So that usually means the sequence is important.
okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Sure. You also notice that it is divided into sort of affective disorders, anxiety disorders, and psychotic disorders, but it doesn't give you a diagnosis of any of these. So they're very careful not to say that this is a diagnostic tool, because it is not, right? It's more closer to, it's closer in the homeless language to an acuity tool, right? Did anybody identify places where they wanted to, where they think it might be helpful? I think that was a good question, David.
Yeah, what I was saying in our group is, obviously we use this for the intake, and we do have other assessments in place, a few things every 3 months, a few things every 6 months. So I think, this is so much more revamped and bigger than it, than the version used to be. So I think this would be really good to, I don't know what type of timeline we would incorporate it, but I guess it would just be based on like per client, when we feel the need for it. Like I said, we do already have assessments in place, but this is like a great one to go back to, just to assess a client, even in more depth, to see what other, direction their treatment could go in,
It is a good way. It is a good way to do that, and that it will help you guide some of the case management work, but it also should alert you to the fact that the person really needs somebody to do the full assessment, because it's not an assessment, right? It's more of an acuity tool or a screen. So that, yeah, I think that's good. The only thing I've been worried about, Miles, is that I'd hate to have this required for every client as part of an intake package, right? Because but if you put it down, like you could use this tool, or you can, catalog your observations, right? But everybody in PATH knows this is for seriously and persistently mentally ill people, so that if you gave people an either or, I also don't want people to, I don't ever want to get in a situation where if somebody's really uncomfortable with this tool, that we push it anyway. And I know that's not what you're saying, but it could be an option at intake for enrollment. Yeah, could be an option. Just make sure it says option.
Yeah, definitely.
Andrea, I didn't see the whole tool, the all the pages, but I know while out on outreach, I deal with a lot of the mental health, and it would
Yep.
definitely be a good helping tool to get an ideal on what type of mental health that each individual have.
Yeah, what type of symptoms? I think that's good. So Leroy, you can download it from the chat. If you look in the chat, are you on your phone?
Yeah, I'm on my phone.
So that's the problem. So Shannon, Leroy was on the list, right? So we've sent you the whole tool.
Yeah, and it's on
Okay.
the CT Boss website. Yeah, also, yeah. But we
All
did
right,
send
cool.
it to people in an email yesterday.
Yep. And you don't have to show people this PowerPoint. There's actually a couple of pages of instructions about the tool that discusses a lot of the same issues.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, sounds good.
All right. Anybody else see an interest in this? Or see an interest where to apply it? Okay. All right. So we have one more poll. And I can launch that, I think. Here it is. So these are what are your concerns? And I think we've talked about some of them, but they're multiple choice. And I will launch it and I will read them. What are you worried about? What are your concerns? So some people say it interrupts engagement. Some people say people will feel uncomfortable. It'll agitate people. Will this be required, which we just talked about? We don't want that. If they don't answer, I can't enroll them. No, you can't enroll them. There are other ways. Why do this if I have to connect somebody with mental health anyway? Isn't this an extra step? The answer is yes. What if the person reports visions and it seems cultural? So these are some things that people brought up. Feel free to add anything.
Again,
Multiple choice pages.
check as many as you applied
Yeah.
in.
Yeah. Wait, the suicidal question should be on here. Yep. What about a positive answer to the suicidal question? That's on there. That's a big one. Okay, we got 12 out of 14. I'm going to end the poll and I'm going to share the results. So number one is person will feel uncomfortable. Another one that had 5, will this be required in all cases? Another one that was a big one is the suicidal, and then it will agitate people, interrupt engagement. What if the person reports visions and it seems cultural? That's a concern. And if they don't answer, I can't enroll them. Okay, so let's take on these. Okay. It could interrupt engagement. That was a lower one, right? But you want to ask what they're concerned about, right? They don't have to take the form. They don't have to take the screening, but what are they concerned about? Because I think that'll tell you something. It's simply to identify things that may be bothering them, and we want to be clear about that. And open a discussion of options of things that appeal to these. So we can start that, you know, there's a lot of places to get help with this. There's a lot of ways in. Person isn't comfortable, offer to stop. We can come back to it. We can not come back to it. It's their choice. And that will not stop enrollment, which was somebody's concern, right? It just means we have to figure out another way or offer another opportunity or offer for another opportunity to go through the form. It may be, I'll tell you what, why don't you hold on to this form? And we can either talk about it again, or you can fill it out. But it doesn't have to be the form. Okay. Agitate, that came up. It could agitate people. David was talking about that. Some people really don't want to talk about mental illness or symptoms about mental illness, or their experiences when they talk about mental illness, they get themselves in trouble. So, that's why you want to talk to how the person reacts. You're going to know that about the mental illness before they do it. Talk to the supervisor, talk to your team about how to approach this form if you want to use it and if it seems applicable. Otherwise, don't do it. This form is not going to work for anything, for everybody. And you know what? The truth is that people would do evidence-based practices don't tell you, but I always tell you when I do evidence-based practices, there is not one thing in this world that works for everybody, right? Nothing. So, people are individuals and we can take that into account. And if somebody gets agitated, stop, use some de-escalation techniques. Explain that this is their choice and make sure that if you're doing this form and you think somebody might get agitated, you might reconsider doing the form. But if somebody does get agitated, you want to make sure that they have a way to walk away, right? So you don't want to do something that might give people strong feelings if they don't have a way to leave or stop it, right? So you want to make sure they do that. People asked if it was required. No, it is not required. It's one of a couple of tools that'll document, suspicion of MI. And you can absolutely enroll people by using another method. Okay, so a bigger one was, will we still be required to refer to a full assessment? The answer is yes. Mini screens document symptoms that the person is feeling and discomfort. You will be required to refer people, but people aren't required to go. We want to figure out a way. The idea is, and I'm not just saying, yeah, do a referral and then forget about it. I'm saying that we want to figure out a way to connect people with treatment because we believe treatment's going to be helpful to them. And that one of the things the MMS says is that people are quite uncomfortable with these symptoms and they're getting in the way of people moving forward. So we always want to try to connect people with mental health assessments and believe they can help. But we want to make sure that we have resources that'll be responsive to the person. We also want the person to start to identify any good experiences they've had dealing with a mental health professional. And even if a lot of people say, oh, it was awful, they put me in the hospital, was there anyone you liked? Was there anything that people did? And we can build from there, right? We can also use our own experience. Like most people come to us and they don't even want to talk about housing because they don't think it's a possibility, right? And they finally develop some trust and they begin to talk about housing. So we can use that as an example, right? It's hard to trust and it's hard to believe. But I'm concerned that these symptoms that are going on in your life are really interfering with your life and they're making you uncomfortable. And together we can figure out a way that might help, right? And it doesn't always have to be medication. It doesn't always have to be a psychiatrist. Some people are much more comfortable with a nurse practitioner or even seeing a therapist who can't prescribe. That's a good start. Anything we can do to help people get a little relief is helpful.
Andrea,
Yeah.
probably using that form, we probably could give it to a provider once they get ready to meet with
Yes.
a provider for mental health service, right? That'll be
Yes.
nice.
Yes, you could absolutely give it to the form, give the form to the person with the person's permission, right? And
Yeah.
that'll give an idea of how they see their symptoms. I would also offer that what you've observed and put in your notes, you also want to make sure that you tell them that. And
Right.
also, if you figured out a way that they engage more readily, what's an approach to them, you want to share that as well. But that's a really good point. You can absolutely give them the form. Okay, we talked a lot about this, but ask what the person is describing as related to a religious belief, to a spiritual belief. The question about do other people share this it's pretty rare that people share a psychosis, but people often share things that might be spiritual, right? So that question about does everybody feel this way about them? Does everybody see this, is really getting at that. And you want to also, because it's important to know the person's values and where they're coming from, get them to describe how it's part of their culture, right? You know, it has come up a lot lately, and we want to be really careful about it. And we want to ask people questions. I use the vaccine example. And I mean, look, I mean, it is completely horrifying that everybody know what the Tuskegee experiment was? Where they took men who had syphilis and they didn't treat them even after the treatment was available, because they wanted to study the effects of it. And that, you know, syphilis is contagious and people gave it to their wives and children. So they put them in a position and they didn't treat them. And syphilis is an awful death. And it was done by the US government. So that, and everybody I know who comes from an African-American community knows that story, right? And that's it. It's both historical trauma, but it also teaches people survival skills, right? And that it's passed from generation to generation, and we have to really be aware of that stuff. And that has certainly had an effect in the African-American community around vaccinations, right? And it's a good reason. It's a damn good reason. So that's why the question is there about how friends and family will see these beliefs, how other people see these beliefs, because they want to decide if it's because if it's within a context or within a culture or within a, you know, a community, we want to make sure that we take that into account. Suicidality. Oh, I left this too late in the session. So if somebody identifies suicidal thoughts and question 4, this should be taken seriously, right? You want to let your supervisor know immediately. You want to keep an eye on them. You want to get any clinical support you can. You want to ask questions about them feeling this now. Are they feeling the suicidal ideation now? Is there any history of suicidality that increases the chances that they'll do something? Is there a plan? Is there a means to execute it? And you can also ask about protective factors. So we know things like connections with family, friends, and services are a protective factor and make suicidality less of a reality. Do they have a safe place to be? Do they have role and purpose? Do they have plans for the future? Do they have any hope that things will go better? Do they have a plan for the future? These are all things that we're looking at in terms of protective factors. With help from a trained clinician, we might want to make a safety plan if it's not immediate, or we might want to make arrangements for the person to be seen immediately. And I can't say this enough. If somebody is actively suicidal, we have to know where our backup is. We not only know how to call mobile crisis, but if mobile crisis, how long do they take to come out? So I gave the example in New York. For a while, mobile crisis took 24 hours to come out. That is no help in a situation where somebody's actively suicidal. So we have to go to another thing. How long does the ambulance come? Do you do it through the fire department? Do you do it through the police department? Do you have somebody in your agency who can write an order through the commissioner of mental health to get transport? That's usually quicker. How long is that going to take? Do you have relationships with the emergency room? So you need to set these things up quickly. I'm not saying that everybody's going to be an emergency, but I am saying that when it's an emergency, you don't want to figure this stuff out. You know, any reference to better off dead indicates the person is experiencing significant distress, and we need to follow up on it, even if they're not immediately suicidal. You need to know how comfortable you are asking these questions about what's the risk level, what's the protective factors, and judging that. I would suggest you do it with somebody who has done it before. You should not do this by yourself the first time. I've also attached a file from SAMHSA, which is a card, which is the 5 things to consider when somebody is suicidal. We've also talked about maybe doing for Path Mental Health 101 that has a lot more on this. And I'm sorry, I should have moved this up. But does anybody have any questions about this or concerns? Or does anybody want more information or want to talk more about suicidality at some point, either doing a case conference or doing a training? Is that something that's coming up for you guys? Is that something you're seeing? Is that something you want to talk about? No, it's not coming up.
You guys you could put something in the chat. You could raise your hand, give a thumbs up, anything like that.
Training would be helpful. Okay. All right. These are all things. The SAMHSA is pretty good. It just gives a basic outline, but I wanted to give you guys something. And I apologize again. I should have moved this up. We should have done this first. But we are coming to the end of the hour and a half. So do people have questions? Comments? You want to turn your cameras on? I'm going to stop sharing so I can see all your faces. So I can see 4 of your, there we go. Okay, any other suggestions? Corinne said training would be helpful. Anything else that people want from this? We hit a lot of areas. No? Okay.
Oh, probably not enough time today, but just how this screening intersects with the substance and alcohol screening, what's it called? CAGE aid?
Yeah, yeah.
Is that a thing?
Yeah, yeah, I gotta say, I'm not overly familiar with that. I've certainly read it, but we should compare it. I'm not sure if it's an assessment or if it's a screening, if it's called a screening. Is it for the purposes of referring people to more treatment or to more assessment? The alcohol and drug screening? David, you're muted.
I'm not that familiar either, so I don't know what I'm talking
Okay,
about.
so I'll take a look at it, and it's something we can follow up with you guys on. If it's a screening for that, it may be a useful tool in the toolbox, so we can definitely take a look at it. But there are a lot of tools out there, you guys. But this one in specific, this is the one that SAMHSA recommends because it's around serious and persistent mental illness. But we can certainly take a look at the other ones.
I just want to take the opportunity to remind you all that there are several recordings of trainings that Andrea has done over the last year, 2 years. One is they're all on the CT Boss website on the training page, and one is working with people with mental illness. So I'm sure we handled the suicidality question there. Not that we can't do
Not in as
something
much
again.
detail. Yeah. I think it probably needs one of its own. It was actually suggested by Columbus House a while ago, and we were thinking about that, but we did do one on mental illness. So yeah, those are available to you. We've also got the case conferences. So, oops, we broke our own rule. We kept you a minute later. I apologize.